Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah wa barakatuh. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Thank you very much for this invitation to speak to this amazing audience. Again, thank you to my sisters at Nahla and to all their partners. It is truly a privilege. I said this last time I was here, and every time that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala permits me to talk to people, especially about the Quran, it is a great privilege and it is an even greater responsibility. So this evening, I'm going to try to speak as clearly as possible. Please put your hand up if I'm going too fast. I will try not to. I do have a presentation that I would like to share with you just to guide the discussion. However, I want to make clear that you're free to ask absolutely anything you want related to the lives of women, and I will try to give you what I have learned is the Qur'anic perspective. The topic, of course, I was given by my lovely sisters at Nahla, which is perfectly fine. It's a beautiful topic, women in family in the Quran. So we're looking specifically at women in family, but our talk will extend sometimes to other roles that women have had. And the subtitle I chose is The Beauty of the Qur'anic Perspective. Because when you study the Quran in earnest, when you do it with an open heart and an open mind, and you do it according to its own rules, so the rules that the Quran itself imposes upon us when we study it, you will come up, in my opinion, with no other words other than it is beautiful. And it is particularly beautiful when we're talking about women. So what and why are we doing here today? First of all, we're discussing women in the family in the Quran, as I just said. And there's something that you have to realize from the very beginning, which is the Quran has a dual technique. The first part of the technique is that the Quran speaks to you, right? From the beginning of Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim all the way to Surah An-Nas at the end of the Quran, it is speaking to you. Absolutely everything in the Quran is calling you to witness its content. The second aspect is the fact that the Quran speaks about you. It speaks about women. It speaks about women directly, and it speaks about women as part of other groups and other human attributes. So when you read the Quran, number one, you are witnessing its entirety, and all of it applies to you, and we're going to see why this is important. And number two, you are reading the directives that have to do directly with you as a woman. So I wanted you to think upon some questions at the beginning of our talk, and you can put in the chat the questions or comments you might have. But I want you to respond to what you believe is an ideal Muslim woman. And then what you think or how you think that woman is represented in the Quran. Where do you see that idealism, if you're familiar with the Quran? Number two, I want you to think of what position, decision, or something you've been told about Islam and women that bothers you. So some decision you've heard or some position you think Islam takes on our status or our rights or our duties that just agitates you. And last, I want you to think about what you believe can be done to change this. So at the start, I want you to have those questions in your mind. I want you to jot things down and to recognize maybe that some of those conceptions, maybe they're misconceptions, maybe they're correct, how they will be addressed throughout this lecture. And then if not, we can discuss them at the end, inshallah. So obviously, today we'll be talking about the Quran as our primary reference, our support, and our intercessor, which means it will intercede for us. We're going to see that in a moment. We're going to talk about our status as women, the idea of equality, the idea of autonomy in the Quran. We're going to talk about the importance of knowing our duties and asserting our rights, or at least being aware of them, so that we can distinguish between culture and custom and the guidance in the Quran. And yes, that means that we might have to challenge fiqh. Now, it's very interesting, and I'm very happy that I got to speak before Dr. Jasser, who's going to be with you next week for those of you who are attending. And he, of course, is a sheikh and a faqih and an imam, just happens to be my husband as well, which is quite interesting. But the thing is, what I want you to recognize is that without what we are going to talk about today, without the tools that the Quran is giving you, you will not be able to challenge any fiqh. You will not be able to stand up for what you believe in, because the Quran is the key source to do that. Yes, of course, knowledge of the Sunnah and of Hadith is important. However, even that has to be checked against the content of the Quran. If there is anything in the Hadith or the Sunnah or the Seerah that goes against the Quran, then something is wrong. Because the Prophet ﷺ was its first living embodiment. According to Sayyidah Aisha, his wife, he was a walking Quran. So if you read or hear of anything that goes against the Quran, then know that it is problematic. Okay. So the Quran is our primary reference and support. Now, the Quran, as I said, is the voice of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in our lives. To neglect the Quran is to neglect that voice. And as I said, it talks to you and it talks about you. And it just doesn't talk about women, it talks about women and other groups, and it talks about men, and it talks about different classifications of people, and it talks about people from other faiths. So it's not that women are isolated examples. Woman is just one of many groups that the Quran talks about. And it does so, particularly in the case of women, because from the beginning of time almost until the end of time, women can be in vulnerable situations. I'm not talking about all women, and the Quran doesn't necessarily talk about all women. What the Quran aims to do, you will find, is to protect the weakest links. It's to protect those who may not necessarily be able to protect themselves. It's to give voice to women when women find it challenging to have a voice. So it was revealed for the benefit of all people, not just Muslims. We read in the Quran, blessed is he who sent down the criterion or discernment on his servant that it may be a warning for the worlds. So it's not just for Muslims, and that's something important to recognize. The guidance in the Quran is for everybody. Belief, that is with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Who believes and who doesn't believe, this is only with Allah. But the benefits of the guidance in the Quran for our life on this earth, with each other and with nature and with everything that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created, that is for everybody. And we have sent down on you, and it means Muhammad alayhi salam, the book, clarifying everything, and a guidance and a mercy and glad tidings for the Muslims. Now, that means that cultural specificity cannot destruct or distort our status and rights and duties as women. So what does that mean? Well, it means that there is a foundational guidance, no matter what culture you're from. You can read it through the lens of your culture, and you actualize it through the lens of your culture, but it is the same fundamental guidance. So for instance, taking, as an example, taking care of parents, that's across cultures, but how we actualize it in every different culture may be different, you know, but it'll be generally the same. Or, and that's not necessarily just a woman's duty, by the way. That's a duty that Muslims have, that believers have. So it's important to recognize when you study the Quran that, in a sense, and I want you to understand this, it stands outside of culture, history, and society. What does that mean? It doesn't mean that it can be understood outside of culture, history, and society, but it means that in every historical moment, in every culture, we have the right, not only the right, we have the duty to read the Quran and interpret it as it applies to the world in which we live and the moment that we are living. And that's something that we have fallen short of doing for quite some time now. we rely way too much on historical perspectives, and we put less emphasis, and maybe even perhaps as an ummah, we respect less things that are coming out in our own times. And the problem with that is we're not dealing with the challenges that we're facing adequately. Now, a quick caution for those of you really focused with me on reading the Quran is the translations. So most non-Arabic speakers are going to read the Quran in English or in Bosnian or in their language. Now, we have to remain cognizant that when you're reading a translation, you are actually reading an interpretation. So you are reading what the translator believed the Arabic meaning to hold. Now, the Arabic is very, very rich language, and a word can have multiple meanings, not diametrically opposed meanings. It just can have broad meanings. And so its representation in any ayah may have multiple meanings, and those multiple meanings, however, are not represented in a translation. So you have to be careful of that. If something bothers you about a translation, it's best to ask someone who knows the Arabic language what the extent of that meaning can be, especially if it's something that's bothering you. So it is the benchmark against which we measure all traditions. That makes it alive and relevant to all times and places. It means we should not confuse it with the culture and customs that we're currently living. And it means that the power of the Quran can move us out of the past and into the present. So we look at the past and we say, what of this Quran was adopted so that it became tradition? And then what of it, if we look at it now, means that tradition is no longer working for the times in which we're living? And how can we now understand the Quran so we can rectify certain practices and move into a better future? Okay, so never confuse Quran with tradition. They're two different things, but we tend to think of tradition as representing the Quran because indeed a lot of tradition did adopt Qur'anic practices, but they're two different things. All right, so what did Prophet Muhammad ﷺ say about the Quran? I just want to share with you because I really want you to recognize how important it is for you to study the Quran. And if you are personally not doing it, how important it is for women to have someone within their circle, another woman perhaps, who is reading the Quran, who is studying it, who can convey the knowledge within it. And of course, it can be a man as well, but I think women have to step up to the game and begin owning this faith for themselves. So the Prophet ﷺ had said, the book of Allah is the way, for it contains information of what happened before you, news of what will come after you, and a decision regarding matters that will occur among you. Okay? It is decisive. It is not in jest or mockery or a joke. Whoever leaves it is a tyrant, and Allah will break him. And anyone who seeks guidance elsewhere, Allah will lead him astray. It is the rope of Allah, the wise reminder, the straight path. Whims cannot deviate it, nor the tongue become confused, and scholars cannot be fully satisfied, of course, due to its scope and depth. It is not worn down by repetition, nor do its wonders ever cease. He who quotes it speaks the truth. He who acts according to it is rewarded, and he who judges according to it is just. And he who invites people to it is guided to the straight path. May Allah make us among them, Ya Rab. All of us, every one of us. He also said, you must recite the Quran and remember Allah, for it is a mention for you in the heavens and a light for you on earth. He likened the Quran to a banquet, and he said, take of it as much as you can. And I'm not going to read every single one. We can provide these slides for your consideration later. So read the Quran, for it will come on the day of resurrection, interceding for its companions. So those who read the Quran and live by it can rest assured that it will witness for you, inshallah, on the day of judgment. So it is unfortunately evidence not just for you, but can be evidence against you. Now, to know the Quran is to know your rights, as I said earlier. And here's a very nice example that some of you may be familiar with. On a certain occasion when Sayyidina Umar, who was the second a caliph after the death of the Prophet ﷺ, he just completed a sermon where he told the men not to pay dowries above a certain amount that he had observed the men in the days of the Prophet limiting themselves to. So when he was done his sermon and he came to leave, a woman approached him and basically she said, you know, are you going against what the Quran says? And he asks, well, what do you mean by that? And she said, did you not read what Allah said? And he said, then she said, if you have given any one of the women a qintar, which is a great amount of gifts, then do not take back any of it. Would you take it in injustice and manifest sin? So he said, I ask Allah for your pardon. Everybody is knowledgeable, more knowledgeable than Omar. The woman is right while the man has erred. Now, this shows you that if you know the Quran, you can challenge fiqh. This was a fiqhi position on his part, you know, and he had a lot of amazing positions, but he made sure that they conformed to the Quran, and those who knew the Quran were able to challenge. And you'll notice his response was very humble. We don't normally get these responses today. Today you would get a response like, oh, you don't know the Sunnah, or you don't know enough about the faith, or we're going by the objectives of what he meant. But the fact is, if you know the Quran, you are confident, at least in what you believe and the path that you will take. So our status as women. The first thing we have to realize is that we have to back up a bit. And we have to think about why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created life and death. And we read in the Quran, blessed is he in whose hand is the dominion, and he is over all things capable, who created death and life to try you as to who is best in works, and he is the endearing, the forgiving. So why is life and death created? So that we may be tried as who is best in works. Women are not an exception to that. You cannot spend your life not being the best you can be because somebody is preventing you, or because somebody believes you should be doing something else. Now, how do we achieve that? Whether you're man or woman or jinn? Again, it's in the Quran. And I did not create the jinn and humankind except to worship me. You are part of humankind. So through your worship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you are going to effect the greatest amount of good in this world. And if you read the Quran in its entirety, you will discover something very, very beautiful, that men are basically explicitly and implicitly commanded to make that journey easier for us with their wealth, with their skills, with their manners, with their protection. They are, if just focus when you're reading, unlearn the prejudices, because men have unfortunately, the fuqaha have unfortunately taken the ahkam, taken the rulings of the Quran and made it as if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is giving them information on how to regulate women. That's not how the Quran speaks. The Quran is basically providing the ahkam or the regulations so that men can regulate themselves, so that we can self-actualize as women, so that we can pursue our path of the worship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with their support. You will find that the way the guidance is worded is all about the men regulating themselves so we can have dignified lives. And that's a very important point. So number one, you, me, all women, we are abd. We are ibad Allah. We are worshippers, servants of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, even before we're women. And this is something we recite in the Fatiha. When you stand in prayer, when you recite the Fatiha, you're not conscious of your womanhood. You are simply in front of Allah as a worshipper. And that is first and foremost your identity. Now, that's what that means. Now, that also means that you carry out a specific order. It just so happened that you and I are women. And the order demands a specific, Allah's order demands specific behaviors, rules, understandings to facilitate our lives because of, first of all, the biological role that many of us play, but not necessarily just the biological role, but the fact of who we are in the revelation. And we're going to talk about that in a moment. I also wanted to let you know something very cool if you're reading the Quran. Women are the exemplars for all of humanity. This is very interesting. And it's very, well, again, it's something that goes two ways. It could be a good thing, but it could be a dangerous thing. So the first two examples that were actually given are not so positive. So Allah gives an example for those who disbelieve, the wife of Noah and the wife of Lot. They were both under two of our righteous servants, but they betrayed them, so they were not availed anything of their or their husband's accounts, and it was said, enter the fire with those entering. So the example to the disbelievers of the world are women. But then Allah says, and Allah gives an example for those who believe. Everybody, men, women, everybody, over the course of history. The wife of Pharaoh, as she said, my Lord, build for me a home in paradise near you and save me from Pharaoh and his doings and save me from an unjust people. And he gives us another example. And note how the first example, both of them are put in one ayah, but when we're coming to the believers, it's separated. And Maryam, the daughter of Imran, who guarded her chastity, so we breathed into her of our spirit, and she affirmed the words of her Lord and his books, and she was of the devout, right? So the exemplars for all of humanity in the Quran are women. For the disbelievers, give them this example. For the believers, give them these two examples. And we know, of course, in Islam that we have four, perfect women. And I asked you to think of perfection when we started this lecture. So we know that Asya, the wife of Pharaoh, and she's not mentioned by her name in the Quran, by the way. She's just mentioned as the wife of Pharaoh. Maryam bint Imran, Khadija bint Khuwaylid, who was obviously the wife of the Prophet, and Fatima, his daughter. Those are the ones that we know about. We know about them from the hadith, right? It's not stated in the Quran, except for, of course, Sittina Maryam, alayhim salam, all of them. So think of these perfect women, and I want you to think of their lives, because that's what you should be thinking about. You shouldn't just take the name and accept it. So when we're told the wife of Pharaoh, who is the wife of Pharaoh? She's a first lady, and she's a first lady of a tyrant. What kind of life did she live? What did she do? This is pre-Islam as we know it, right? So she obviously was Muslim in some sense, but it's the pre-Islam that we know. And yet she is identified as one of the perfect women of Islam. Think of her life, think of how she must have lived, where she must have lived, what she must have done. And that constitutes perfect in Islam. Think of course, Sittina Maryam is a different kind of example because she is so unique. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives her to us as an example to reflect also on her life. Sittina Maryam was muharrara. Muharrara means freed from. She's actually the only woman, the only person that we know in the Quran that is muharrar. Muharrar means freed from. She was freed from need, freed from all kinds of needs. Think of her life. Think of what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala burdened her with. And how she handled it and what she did with her life and how she traveled on her own and how she took care of her son. Very, very interesting. Again, and did it as a single person. Think of Sayyidah Khadija. She entered into Islam much later, but she was also considered Muslim from the very beginning. Think of her life. Think of her emphasis on her business and her success as a businesswoman and the caravans that she managed and the people that she managed, and that was quite a bit of her life before she met the Prophet ﷺ. Think that she's the one that proposed to him or sent interest in him. This constituted perfection. Look at the variety of their lives. And Sayyidah Fatma is the same thing. So when you hear these things, I want you to reflect on who are these people and how did that constitute perfection? What is it about them that renders somebody, perfect or refined, let's just say. So women and the family. The family is obviously very central to Islam because it is central to human well-being. And we start Surah An-Nisa, the very surah that talks about women, with, "O you people, heed your Lord, who created you from one self or being, nafs, and created from her pair, and propagated from them many men and women. And heed Allah, through whom you demand your dues, and al-arham, translated as the wombs. Indeed, Allah is over you a surveillant," or raqib. So this is the very opening of Surah An-Nisa. Yeah, when you read the Quran, you stop at that and you say, why? Why is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala opening the chapter on women with this unifying and challenging ayah? So it's an ayah that's telling people, I created you from one being, all of you. It's telling men mostly, because most of the surah is going to be addressing male behavior. You're all from one source. And yes, the nafs in Arabic is a feminine form. So if you're reading translations that say he or him or Adam, it's incorrect. The Arabic is in feminine form. The nafs is a feminine form. So he created from her pair, and then propagated from them many men and women. Again, part of the translation, unfortunately, that is lost on people that read translation is the forms of the Arabic language. What is feminine and what is masculine, and how that impacts our understanding of concepts, and how that balances the text of the Quran and our understanding of the universe. So obviously this common origin means that we're connected through uterine ties to varying degrees, from one's immediate family, your mother, your father, your siblings, to much more extended family, and then obviously through blood and marriage, and it gets wider and wider. And we read in the Quran, and it is he who created this sentient being, or bashar. When you read bashar, it's normally translated as human, but bashar has a different meaning, from water. Then he made him a lineal and marital relation, and ever is your Lord capable. So family, very important in the Quran. All of us are related in one way or another. And through the narratives about family in the Quran, we learn about women and their status and their rights and the prerogatives they took and their autonomy. And that's part of fiqh that's missing. Fiqh is focused on rulings, on commands. But the narratives of the Quran are where you find how women lived, what choices they made, what authority they had, what power they had, how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala responded to them and to their prayers. That's where you find it, in the narratives. And yes, you can use the narratives as well to challenge and to think and to reconsider. We also learn about women, as I said, through the commands, because it talks about women, not just to women, and we learn through the concepts. So a really nice concept that, again, is lost in translation is the walidain and the abawain. So when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَبِالْوَالِدَيْنِ إِحْسَانًا, when he uses walidain, walida, it means those who gave birth to you. And of course, the mother takes the center stage in that. Walida, walidati, my mother. If he uses abawaik, or abawayhi, as he does for Sayyidina Yusuf, then the greater responsibility or emphasis is being placed on the father. Now, you will find in the Quran that the vast majority refers or emphasizes the role of the mother. It's only 2 or 3 times that we see the father, which is extremely interesting. And that does not belittle the role of the father, but it shows how the role of mother is emphasized. Again, something that might be lost in translation that I just wanted to share with you. So women and men, this is the major partnership on earth. It's not men with men. It's not men with their children or their sons or their daughters. It's not people with nature. It's women with men. When the Quran starts, when creation starts, this is how it starts. Women and men. And perhaps one of the most sad challenges of this ummah is that we've lost sight of that for a very long time now. And if we can get that straight again, I think we have a fighting chance. Now, again, when you read the Quran in its entirety and you're reflecting, you realize that this is the major partnership on earth. That's how it starts. Uskun anta wa zawjuka. You and your wife. Her name isn't even mentioned. And that's not to belittle you, ladies. Please do not think that. That's modern nonsensical stuff. What Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is doing from the very beginning of Revelation, as we're going to see in a second, is to make sure that we consider each other partners. In the end, we're one. It's not you and her individuals. No, it's you and your partner. And yes, the khitab or the address is to the man. Yes, it is to the man. Why? Allah knows. Because he's going to give him a daraja, he's going to give him a degree, as we're going to see later. That degree doesn't mean he's better, but it means he has a higher responsibility. For what? We're going to talk about it. So if you continue in the Quran, you're going to realize if you're focusing on the male-female relationship, you're going to come across a number of threats. The first threat is political, and we're going to talk about that. The second is sihr, or what we think of as magic. The third is sexual deviation. These come in order in the Quran. The fourth is divorce, and that's why the Quran spends so many ayat on how to do it amicably. And the final is betrayal. So these threats are threats to the male-female relationship, and particularly in the context of marriage. Now, the Quran also offers remedies, right? And all of the remedies are directed towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The first is behavioral, and it has to do with respect, mutual respect between men and women. The second is generosity. The third is intimacy. And the fourth is commitment. Sorry, I'm just looking at the time here. Sania, can you tell me when there's 5 minutes just on the screen? Thanks. Okay. So even in separation, there should not be an end to, let's just say, the sister-brotherly relation, the figurative relation between men and women, the sacred communal bonds. That should not end with divorce. Unfortunately, the way it's practiced in recent times, that bond is broken completely, and the Ummah loses sight of the fact that it is a higher value than divorce, right? For the Ummah to stay together and for men and women to find amicable ways to end this sacred relationship. And then I'm also going to tell you a little bit about why, which was a very big problem in our faith, and it still is, not in our faith, but in the way we practice it, why we don't see women-initiated divorce in the Quran, why the fuqaha had to come up with khula, and why that really wasn't necessary if men were following the sunnah. So the major partnership. The story of creation in the Quran, the first time around in Surah Al-Baqarah, begins with the mention of Adam, Sayyidina Adam. So Allah teaches Adam the names or the essence of all things. Then he asks him to inform the angels of the names of all things. And hopefully you're all familiar with the story. And the angels are eventually told to prostrate to Adam, except Iblis, who felt above such an act. And he responds, you know, when he's asked why you didn't prostrate, he says, because I'm better in creation, having been made of fire, in contrast to Adam, who is made of soil. Now, why is this important? Why am I telling you something like this in a lecture of women and family? Because we have to go to first principles to recognize Adam's responsibility and how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is presenting that story in its first iteration. It's presented slightly differently in its second iteration later. But in the first iteration, the emphasis and the responsibility is being put on Adam. And this is different from other faiths, particularly the Christian faith, right? So we're recognizing this. We're also recognizing when Iblis does not prostrate, what his excuse is. His excuse is, I'm better. And if you look at the way our communities are behaving today, they're falling into that trap. When Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives especially men, and I'm not coming down hard on men. I know it's Father's Day and happy Father's Day to everybody. But when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala guides men and he tells them, الرجال قوامون على النساء, and we're going to talk about this in a minute, the qawama, he qualifies it with what he has favored you, one above the other, and what you spend of your wealth. Now, for males particularly, and the way fiqh has been understood, that somehow the woman owes something in return, or somehow she can't be worthy because they're coming from this background that woman was created from Adam or from his rib, or all of this stuff that has nothing to do with Islam and nothing to do with how the Quran is representing this story. So they felt above what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is asking them. He's saying, control yourselves. He's saying, support women in their journey to self-actualize. He's saying, allow them their purposeful paths to worship me. He's saying, be generous with your wealth and give, and with your skills. But if you're going to fall into the trap of shaitan, of I was created first, and I was created better, and I was created stronger, and I was given more favor, that is no different than the way Iblis looked at this initial situation of I am better, so how are you asking him to how are you asking me to prostrate to him? The same thing. I am better, so how are you asking me to give? And we see this in particularly, and it comes very strongly in Allah's commands to men when it comes to orphans and the marriage of orphans. And it's in Surah An-Nisa. This is the first command that comes after the ayah we just read. It begins talking about orphans and the marriage to orphans. And it's basically saying, don't you dare think that you can marry them to take their wealth. They have a right to their wealth, and you have a duty to train them and test them and make sure that they can manage their own wealth, and then you have to give it to them, which means that even if you marry them, you're going to have to give them their wealth. You are not going to combine their wealth with yours. And this was both a protection for the orphan and a protection for their fathers. Because if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had not said this, then the first victims of war would be the girls that had wealthy parents, or a wealthy father in particular, because it means if you killed her father, you can marry her and take the wealth. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, none of that. Okay, so again, read the Quran with an eye that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is your guardian, is your protector. And you'll be reading the ayat in a very different way. Okay, so when we reflect on that story, we see that that is unfortunately a trap that men and women have fallen into. And the Iblis, of course, says that he will demonstrate that the vast majority of people are ungrateful for Allah's mercies. And Adam is warned, then we said to Adam, this is an enemy for you and your wife, so let him not take you out of the garden that you may toil or tashqa. And in the second iteration of this, he's talking to both of them. Now, the first mention of the wife of Adam, we don't have her name in the Quran as Hawa, of course, that's who she is, but she's not mentioned with that name. Zawjuka is how she's mentioned, your pair, your wife, indicating this mutual togetherness from the very beginning. And we're also told that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala made women as something beautiful. The love of the allure of women, among other things, has been beautified for people, beautiful for men and beautified for women. And you don't need to look far to see that. When you look at women's magazines, they're full of women. Our magazines, the magazines that are made for women, are not full of men. They're full of other women. And so you see the truth of the Qur'anic provision that women have been made beautiful. So Allah entreats Adam and his wife to live in heaven and to eat of what they want and not let Satan trick them, obviously, into eating of the tree. And you know the story. Both of them then in the second iteration have mutual responsibility for their fall. And so there is no blame on either the woman or necessarily, or the man when it comes to the Islamic perspective. And we have to know that story to know how it all started and why it is so important that we get our relationship with men back on track, and them with us, of course. So, Sanya, am I good on time? 5 minutes? Okay. So the grant of a wife and the partnership of men and women is a natural part of life. It is a sunnah. Does it mean we all have to get married? No. Does it mean it's preferable for everybody? No. Because even if you do not have a husband, if you do not want a husband, irrespective of what life gives you, you are still figuratively a sister in some male's life, okay? So a lot of this still applies. So the wife or a partner is a natural outcome of living, and Allah has made for you from yourselves, min anfusikum, pairs, azwajan, and made for you from your pairs, children and grandchildren, and provided for you from what is good. So is it that they believe in falsehood and in Allah's blessings they disbelieve? He also states in the Quran, and we did send messengers before you and gave them wives and progeny, and it was never the case that a messenger came with an ayah except with Allah's permission. For every lifetime is a book or decree.